Hello, this is Donna Warren from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and today we will be putting together the 3 ways that 2 ideas can be related to each other in an argument in order to graphically represent a more complex piece of reasoning. We're actually going to be using the same little argument bits that we used in the review. We're just going to put those shapes together. So let's remember what the first shape was. The first way that 2 ideas were related to each other that we reviewed was this reason-conclusion relationship. Knowing that my neighbors watch the stars, I concluded from that little arrow that my neighbors are extraterrestrials. Right? That was the first relationship that we saw. The other relationship that we saw added my neighbors are extraterrestrials together with the idea that all extraterrestrials can communicate telepathically to conclude that my neighbors can communicate telepathically. So I'm going to take the idea that my neighbors are extraterrestrials and I'm going to add it to the idea that extraterrestrials can communicate telepathically to conclude that my neighbors can communicate telepathically, like that. Note again how well the puzzle piece relationship captures what's going on between this dependent reason down here and this dependent reason. So here we have a dependent reason relationship. The third relationship was realizing that I can't do everything my neighbors can, in part because I can't communicate telepathically, but also because my neighbors can install their own siding. And the idea that my neighbors can communicate telepathically and the idea that my neighbors can install their own siding are really different kinds of reasons to believe that I can't do everything that my neighbor can. They have different themes. There's the siding installation theme and the telepathic communication theme. Now, this is a reasonably complex argument structure, but what I want to stress here is how the entire structure, complex as it is just composed out of those 3 basic kinds of relationships: dependent reasons, adding, reason conclusion, dependent reasons, and independent reasons, right? That's really all there is. That's why mapping's kind of neat, because you can create these complicated, very sophisticated argument structures with just the simplest of relationships. But there is something new that has happened here. I mean, we've talked about reasons and conclusions. I've talked about premises periodically. I've said, for instance, this is a premise because there's nothing above it, right? We're not being given any reason to believe it. So is this. That's a premise for the same reason. So is this. That's a premise for the same reason. But this guy right here, that's not a premise anymore. Can you see why not? It's not a premise because I'm being given reasons to believe it up here. I'm not taking this for granted. This is being supported by other ideas. But it's not the main thing I'm concluding either. So I'm going to call this a sub-conclusion. It is a conclusion because reasons are being given to believe it, but it's not the main conclusion or the ultimate conclusion. So, premise, inference, sub-conclusion. Premise. Note, premise and sub-conclusions can be dependent reasons because they are both reasons. A reason can be either a premise or a sub-conclusion. What makes these reasons is that they are being given as reason to believe this. Now, what's this? Premise or a sub-conclusion? Well, it's a sub-conclusion because reasons are being given to believe it. subconclusion, inference, ultimate conclusion. Premise, inference, ultimate conclusion. Now, whether we call something a premise or a subconclusion is really not the important thing. The important thing is not the terminology. The important thing is the concept and the different role played in the argument by this and by this, and the implications of that different role for how we evaluate these things. So far, we've just talked about evaluating premises, things that are being taken for granted, and inferences, relationships between ideas that are evidentiary in nature, right? This is being given as a reason to believe that. We haven't talked about subconclusions because we haven't seen them before. But let's think about this. For a premise, it was acceptable for us to say, I don't think it's true. Why was that acceptable? That was acceptable because an argument is presenting you with a premise and just telling you, here, believe this. That's kind of the spirit in which the argument is offering it to you, as something for you to accept and believe, right? Basically on the word of the person who wrote the argument. I'm just saying, here, just believe this. Because the argument is doing that, an appropriate response is to say, I don't believe it. I don't think it's true. Now, ideally, you might want to be able to back that up, but that's an appropriate kind of response to that sort of a claim. This is not that sort of a claim. In this argument, the argument isn't saying, look, my neighbors are extraterrestrials, just accept it, right? Just believe it because I'm telling it to you. It's not doing that. It's saying, be convinced of this for the reasons that I've given you. That's a big difference. Be convinced of this. Believe this. Different. So, if you don't believe this, and I hope you don't, it's not really an acceptable move to say, I just don't accept it. I'm sorry, I think that's false. I don't believe it. It's not an acceptable move because this argument isn't asking you to believe it. This argument is asking you to be convinced of it. So what you need to do is say something like, I'm not convinced of this, and explain why. It's the explaining why by looking at the argument for it that's really crucial here. If you're not convinced of this, we need to explain why you aren't convinced of it. Why aren't you convinced of this? Is it because you don't believe that my neighbors watch the stars? Or is it because you think that even if they did watch the stars, that wouldn't make them extraterrestrials? Probably the latter, right? Probably the inference is wrong here. Inference is weak. The point is, don't just reject this. If you don't find yourself in agreement with the subconclusion, look up in the diagram. Always look up. See what's wrong with the reasoning for that subconclusion. Same thing down here. Suppose that you don't believe that my neighbors can communicate telepathically, nor should you believe that. That's a subconclusion. You can't just say, no, sorry, I don't believe it. Because this is a subconclusion, we need to look up. We need to see what's wrong with the reasoning for it, why you are not convinced of it. Okay, so let's take a look. Is it the inference? Let's check that inference. Suppose someone believed that my neighbors are extraterrestrials, and suppose they believe that extraterrestrials communicate telepathically. How likely is that person going to believe that my neighbors can communicate telepathically? Pretty darn likely. In fact, they're guaranteed to believe it. That's a valid inference. So, if you don't like this and you think this inference is valid, the problem has to be somewhere further up. Well, is it this reason or is it this reason? Because you need them both. Now, I have no idea if aliens can communicate telepathically or not, but I don't think that's the more problematic reason. I think the more problematic reason is this one. You don't believe that my neighbors are extraterrestrials. And now here we go again. Because this is a subconclusion, you can't just say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept it. You have to say, I'm not convinced of it, and then take a look at why the reasoning that the argument has given you fails to be convincing. Is it that you don't believe the premise, or is it that you don't like the inference? And as we've said, I think the problem here is the inference. Now, what does that tell us? that tells us that because this inference is weak, this entire line of reasoning doesn't stand up, right? This entire line. But if an argument has more than one line of reasoning, it's good if even one of those lines is good. This line might save it. Let's check. My neighbors can install siding. Therefore, my neighbors can do something that I can't do. What about that line of reasoning? Well, do you think that my neighbors can install siding? That's a premise. So if you wanted to, you could say, not buying it, I don't think that your neighbors can install siding. But I think that would be a strange thing for you to say because, you know, I live next door to them and I've seen them install siding, and I mean, why would you, that would be a strange thing for me to lie about. So let's assume that it's true. If it's true, if someone believes that it's true, how likely are they to believe that my neighbors can do something that I can't do? Well, I suppose you need to know a little bit about me, but you'd need to know, for instance, that I can't install siding, but I really can't. I think this inference is not perfect, but it's pretty good. So, this line of reasoning, hurrah, okay? Now, what does that mean about the argument? The argument's good because that teeny weeny line of reasoning over here saved it. What does that tell us about the ultimate conclusion? Does it tell us that the ultimate conclusion is true? It does. Good arguments give us reason to believe the ultimate conclusion. Bad arguments tell us nothing about the ultimate conclusion. Good arguments give us reasons to believe the ultimate conclusion because if we think an argument's good, we think that the premises are true, we think that the truth of the premises establishes the truth of the ultimate conclusion, so we would be hard-pressed to not think that the ultimate conclusion, this guy down here, is true. Wow. If you followed all of that, be very happy. Be very happy. More later, but for now, if you followed it, do a little happy dance. Be very happy. You are streets ahead of many people. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.